All right, good morning, everyone. Today is Thursday, June 25th. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, I'm Joanne Koontz. I'm here with my partners, Jackie Durham and Marina Parkin. As always, we are trying to bring our local business community all the top topics that you're interested in hearing about. And of course, what the gift that keeps on giving is PPP loan forgiveness. So the ladies joined you on Tuesday to talk a little bit about the new forgiveness application rules. And today we're going to take a little bit deeper dive into the safe harbors, the exemptions, and the application forms themselves. You'll be relieved to know that Jackie's had her magnifying glass out for quite some time now. And although we are coming to you today, I'm certain this will continue to change. This application form seems to have taken on a life of its own. So it's living and breathing and changing every day. Some of the news is actually getting better as we go, which is kind of surprising. So without further ado, I will let you get started.
All right. So as Joanne mentioned, we're going to be covering exemptions, safe harbors, and then we're going to go over the documentation that is supposed to be supplied with and retained by borrowers with respect to the two different forgiveness applications. Now, something I want to clarify is we separate these into exemptions and safe harbors, but really they're all exemptions. I'm only doing this for clarification because the forgiveness application separates them as exemptions and safe harbors, but SBA isn't necessarily consistent in how they reference these. Sometimes they call them safe harbors, sometimes they call them exemptions. At the end of the day, they're all going to apply the same way as exemptions. So I wouldn't get too hung up on safe harbor versus exemption.
Nobody at SBA is hung up on the names. Why should we be?
Right.
Rules, schmoles.
Exactly. So just to circle back on the general rules surrounding a reduction in forgiveness, if you have a reduction in your employee headcount, or if you reduce your employees' salaries or wages by more than 25%, you're going to have some reduction in your total eligible forgiveness. So the rules that apply to the headcount is basically whatever percentage that your headcount is reduced by is going to reduce your total forgiveness. So if you reduce your employee headcount by 20%, your total eligible forgiveness is also going to be reduced by 20%. The reduction in wages beyond the 25% threshold is actually going to reduce your forgiveness dollar for dollar based on that excess. So for example, if you had an employee who was paid $1,000 per week and you reduce their wages to $700 per week, that $50 amount is what is going to reduce your forgiveness multiplied by your covered period. So if it's 8 weeks, you would multiply it by the 8-week period, or if it's 24 weeks, you would multiply it by the 24-week period. And then that product is going to take that amount off the top of your total eligible forgiveness. So what's nice though is we have a handful of exemptions that have been implemented since the passage of the CARES Act and with the Flexibility Act. And we actually had some new regulations that were released 2 days ago after our morning webinar that provided a little clarification about certain of these exemptions. So the first one I'm going to get started with is the rejection of an offer of rehire. So if you terminate an employee and then you offer to rehire that same employee at the same rate of pay for the same number of hours, and that employee is unable or unwilling to accept that offer, and then you're unable to replace that employee with a similarly qualified employee on or before December 31st, you will be exempt from that reduction in your forgiveness. Now, something that the interim rule that was issued a couple days ago really drove home was the documentation requirement. So you have to really make sure that you document the written offer to rehire. You also document the rejection of that offer, which, you know, in some instances, if you say sent them an email and they refuse to respond to that, maybe just having a read receipt or something like that that shows that they received the email and just refused to respond. And also keeping records of your attempts to rehire. So you need to keep your job postings. I would also keep copies of any resumes you receive because you have to show that you didn't get any qualified applicants that could have reasonably filled that position. Something else that was also confirmed by the interim rule that was issued a couple days ago is that they are carrying forward that requirement that you notify the unemployment office within 30 days of that rejection. So that is still going to be a requirement with respect to this particular exemption. All right. Also, if you reduced your employees' hours and then you offer to restore those hours, and for whatever reason they reject that offer, this is also going to exempt you from this reduction and your forgiveness. Again, they reiterate that you have to maintain records to document the offer and the rejection. Also, in one of the previous interim rules that was issued last month, they confirmed that if your employee is fired for cause or resigns or requests a schedule reduction, that's also not going to reduce your forgiveness. Again, you have to keep the documentation to confirm this. If there is a request for a schedule reduction, just make sure that the employee puts that into writing. And even if it was something that was requested months ago, as long as you get that employee's email confirming the contents of that conversation and just having that in your file for, you know, the 6-year period where you're supposed to hang on to these documents to substantiate the certifications regarding these exemptions, you should be fine. All right, and then we're going to jump into the safe harbors as they're referred to in the forgiveness application. The first one is that limited operation safe harbor that came down with the Flexibility Act, and basically provides that if your hands were essentially tied because of governmental orders or restrictions, and there is a reduction in your full-time employee headcount as a result, you're going to be exempt from that reduction. So it needs to be a direct or indirect result of some kind of order or guidance, and you need to make sure that you keep documentation substantiating this, the time period that it fell in, and in what aspect it tied your hands with. So a lot of people are automatically thinking of restaurants and the hospitality business when they think of this exemption, but there's a number of other businesses that have maybe a brick and mortar storefront, but also have an online presence and have e-commerce in that respect. So you might have a warehouse where you're packaging and still shipping out your products, but maybe your brick and mortar storefront is shut down. That is enough to meet this safe harbor. So it doesn't have to be a result of you are completely shut down and can have no employees. It can be half and half. So it really, the act offers a lot of flexibility with this one, which is nice.
Yeah, I wanted to also jump in here. The other types of businesses that I'm thinking about here, Jackie, are the medical offices that were closed, and some of them were reopened, and I think some of them may still not be reopened. And, you know, we're talking about countrywide here, so this is not just what was happening in Florida. I think a lot of medical offices were closed early on and were able to reopen early on, maybe before they got PPP proceeds, but it's different all across country. So I think those businesses as well. And I also wanted to point out here, because I did get a couple of questions about what is really the same level. I think you're absolutely right, Jackie. It doesn't have to be a certain percentage of, you know, I'm operating at 25% capacity or 50. It just is not the same level. So really, if you do have part of your business like the shipping piece or online presence that's still open, but you have the warehouse that's closed, whatever percentage of the business that turns into be, it's okay. It just means you're not at the same level as you were before. So there's really no guidance or any particular rule as we know of right now that really defines what, you know, if there's anything that has to be a certain percentage of reduction.
Right, right. And they also go on to say that you have to be able to certify that you've documented in good faith that the reduction stems directly or indirectly from the COVID requirements or compliance. And it also requires that you retain relevant borrower financial records. So basically the reduction in your employee headcount sort of has to tie to, it has to be consistent with the restrictions that are being imposed by the governmental authorities, but also needs to sort of be in line with your borrower financial records and what those reflect. So I think as long as people aren't trying to take advantage of this, it's going to be very easy to demonstrate this and to hold up the order that said that your doors had to be shut during these dates and which employees had to be let go as a result. Also, I think this is the last safe harbor. This is the one that came in under the original CARES Act and then was expanded by the Flexibility Act. And it basically provides that if you reduced your employee headcount, or if you reduced wages between the dates of February 15th and April 26th, and then you correct this this reduction on or before December 31st, then you'll be exempt from that reduction in your forgiveness. Now, the basis for this, though, is what you paid the employees and what their hours looked like as of February 15th. So I feel like a lot of people are kind of glossing over that part. And I just want to make sure that needs to be your benchmark for establishing what the restoration needs to look like. Something else I wanted to touch on, because I feel like there's some confusion surrounding this. One of the rules that came out in the last couple of days with the interim rules is the fact that if you spend your PPP funds before the expiration of your covered period, so if you have a 24-week covered period and you get all of your PPP funds expended and you're ready to file your forgiveness application and get back to normal, you can do that. But the restrictions associated with your full-time equivalent employee headcount is still going to carry forward even after you file this forgiveness application. It doesn't just get cut off because you go ahead and file your forgiveness application. And I want to make that very clear because I'm seeing bad information being circulated out there stating otherwise. So the filing of the forgiveness application is not going to cut short any kind of statutory restrictive period. So you're still going to be certifying on that loan application that this is how many employees I had, this was their rate of pay, and this is the basis for my application through the end of the covered period, which extends beyond when you may be filing your forgiveness application. So if anything happens and you do have to let someone go or you do lose an employee, I would still make sure that you're maintaining that documentation to substantiate your basis for one of these exemptions.
Yeah, I would most certainly wait till the end of your covered period to apply for forgiveness, even if you elected to have the 24-week covered period instead of the 8-week because you needed the extra time. And then, another 2 payrolls later, you're already done. Definitely wait till the end because you do need to maintain the salary and the head count at the same level. And a couple of points that I wanted to bring up here. Number one, I think the confusion there arises in that since the safe harbor for restoration of the head count and salaries got extended till December 31st, the point is that you don't have to wait till December 31st to submit the forgiveness application. If you restore your head count earlier, after your covered period, you can apply at that time. So essentially, you have to keep your head count and salary level the same throughout the covered period, but you don't have to keep it the same till December 31st. So if your covered period ends September 30th, for example, the 24 weeks, as long as you kept your employee count through September 30th and your salary level, you are ready to submit your forgiveness application. If you had to let somebody go and you restored them by October 31st, you're ready to file for a forgiveness application on October 31st. In other words, you don't have to wait till December 31st and maintain the same count. When that extension of the safe harbor for the restoration got extended, there was a lot of confusion in the press, and I was reading a lot of the practitioners sort of questioning as to what does the December 31st date mean. But with this particular application coming out now in the instructions, as Jackie and I are reading it, it appears that December 31st is not the date you have to keep your headcount and salary level the same, but definitely through the covered period. And if you did have to let someone go, if you did restore them sometime after your covered period, as soon as you're done with that, please submit the application for forgiveness. So that's key. This is where a little bit of that alphabet soup comes from. The other thing that I wanted to mention here is, I don't know, Jackie, if you can go back a point on that last safe harbor about the dates. There was also confusion about if I have to let someone go and I restore them. Keep in mind that if you had to cut the number of full-time equivalents or salaries between the period of February 15th and April 26th, this safe harbor only applies if you had to do it during that time that you have a restoration safe harbor. If you had to let someone go at a different time frame, then you still can see if the other exemptions or safe harbors apply to you, but you won't fall into this. So if you had to let someone go in May, you may still have an exemption, but you don't have a requirement to restore these people if you want to keep your full loan forgiveness. So this is where you really have to work through your numbers and see when the salary was reduced, when the headcount was reduced, and then see if you have the ability to restore them to fall under the safe harbor. Because I also was getting a couple of questions, and this was earlier on in the process about, well, should I, I need to let someone go. Should I let them go before or after? And that's where we were very particular about giving advice to fall within that time period, because we said, if you do have to let someone go or even furlough them, do it during that time, because then as the money comes in, you can immediately bring them back, get that restoration of the full-time equivalent, and immediately fall under the safe harbor and not have a problem at all. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And something else I want to note, I've been getting some questions about situations where a borrower may have to terminate for cause an employee, or they voluntarily resign. And they're wondering, okay, do I have that similar requirement to at least attempt to replace this employee as I do under the other exemption where I haven't terminated them for cause? I'm not seeing anything that suggests that, but they may later come out with something supplementing this, saying, hey, you have to make, some kind of efforts to replace these employees as well. I think they're going to be a little more flexible on that, because the termination for cause is a reasonable reason to release these employees. And also, if they decide to walk away on their own accord, the act is really trying to protect the employees, and these are sort of different circumstances. So I wouldn't say off the cuff that there's any requirement that you actively try to replace those employees. That's not in place just yet, that restriction.
Absolutely.
Also, under the recent regulations that were issued, they clarified that even though we have that 10-month period where if you don't make application for loan forgiveness, that your deferment period expires and you have to start making payments, you are technically entitled to apply for forgiveness as long as you apply prior to the maturity of the loan. So you can basically apply at any point during the entire term of the loan for forgiveness for whatever reason. So I don't know why anyone would sit on it for that long, but you're entitled to. You're going to have to start making payments after 10 months, but you can still later apply for that forgiveness. That was clarified.
Yeah, hurry up before the rules change again.
Yeah.
Hurry up.
It's interesting. I still have some clients that are applying for the loans, or because June 30th is the deadline. And I had a couple of questions this week. I think a lot of people were sitting back and assuming it was no longer available. And as they're probably talking to their other business owner friends. And I had probably 2 or 3 emails early this week that said, I've been sitting back and sort of watching with one eye open some of your webinars and reading some of the stuff. Do you think I can still apply? And then I said, definitely, why not? There's still money in the program. And if you qualify. And to be honest with you, I think applying later may have some benefit in that you understand a lot of those rules, particularly relating to what does it mean to have economic uncertainty. So we screamed and yelled about that particular subject fairly early on in the process. And, I think that there's quite a few of our clients that did give money back because they, although applied early, realized that they probably didn't have a good cause for economic uncertainty, which I think was the right thing to do on their end. And, this is where you really see the good come out of in people in this process. But there's certainly enough money in the program still left that I would. And the banks, I think, are pretty smooth about taking applications in now. So definitely do it.
Well, and another thing, I think that economic uncertainty really put, they thought they were going to run through the second batch of money in like a week, and they were already talking about a third batch of money. And then when all of the economic uncertainty was hot in the press, I think people got scared to apply. Like, it's not worth it. It's not enough money. I don't want to go to jail forever. Because it was like WebMD. You would read like slap on the wrist to die in jail for life. So there was like, I think just a lot of uncertainty about whether or not you had economic uncertainty. And for the people who were like, I'm going to make it without it, I'm not going to chance it. It just wasn't really, really worth it. We do have a question with respect to the loan forgiveness, but also might touch into something that you guys aren't comfortable with. Elizabeth says, we had an employee get injured and their ability to fulfill their job responsibilities were drastically reduced, causing us to employ vendors to complete their work. Due to this, we are reducing the pay for the employee by 50%. Workers' comp will pay a portion of the difference. I have paperwork for the situation. Do you think this will negatively impact our PPP loan forgiveness? Because
how injured is the employee? And I ask this because first of all, when did the reduction in pay occur?
It will start this week. This reduction.
All right, so we're out of the restoration safe harbor, and that's really unfortunately the only safe harbor that applies to a reduction in wages. None of all the other safe harbors and exemptions apply to a reduction in your FTE headcount.
Okay.
So I would say I'm trying to think of a way to maneuver that to fall under one of the other exemptions, but since it's a reduction in wages, I don't see how it's going to. But I would like to think on that and circle back with you. But off the cuff, unfortunately, no, it doesn't. The only exemption that we have that applies to the reduction in wages is that's not going to apply because the reduction didn't happen within that period of time.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry, I don't want to take you off track too much, but.
And by the way, you guys, I think we saw something come through from a lender talking about when they might start accepting forgiveness applications. And it seems like some lenders are going to be pushing this out to even mid-August before they're going to start accepting those applications. So that's kind of good to know. I wonder if borrowers are encountering that elsewhere.
It looked like in that email that I think we circulated between us yesterday, it said that was a Chase Bank, I believe.
It was Chase.
If the money was received in April, then August is when they'll be ready. If it's later, May or June, then stay posted.
The name of the game.
And it looks like these people might be able to ride out their full covered period regardless, and we don't have to worry about them filing early. So,
and you know, the questions that I am getting quite a bit from my clients on the covered period is, do I have to notify anybody if I chose 8 weeks or 24 weeks? And from what I understand, you don't have to say anything. You just go through the 24-week covered period. And I think if the bank does reach out to you, there may be some way to communicate back to them that you're electing the 24-week, but I haven't seen anything as far as SBA rules are concerned that you need to do anything special on that. Do you guys agree?
Yeah, I just expect you'll indicate that with your application information. That's what I'm expecting.
Yep.
Like here, it's even on the one Jackie's got up now, even indicating the covered period. Like you're telling them what you think it is. I don't know. I'm not real sure why that's 2 blanks. I kind of feel like it should be a checkbox of 8 weeks or 24 weeks with a starting date, because this is going to allow people to say things like, you know, for title, Mr. and Mrs. instead of managing member in Sunbiz, but just leaving it way open for people to be all kinds of wrong. So yeah. I wouldn't set the form up that way. At least if you give them the 8 or 24, one of them has to be right.
And to be honest with you, there's still confusion about that as well, because we said the beginning of the covered period is really when you first get the loan proceeds, but then there's also the day when you actually get a loan number assigned to you. And I think that also triggers the beginning of the period. Jackie, I think we mentioned, we touched on that, I feel like several weeks ago. And there was something about once you get that loan number, that begins your loan period. I mean, you should have your funds within a day or so, but that may make a difference from when your payroll period starts.
Well, no, the day you get your funds is going to trigger the start of the covered period, and then you can select the covered period to be where you track your payroll, or you can elect that alternative payroll covered period, which is the first day of your next payroll that occurs within the covered period. The date that the SBA assigns the loan number is what's going to determine whether or not you have the 2-year term or the 5-year term. So for whatever reason, that's the benchmark they use to establish whether or not you can benefit from the 5-year term or if you're stuck with a 2-year term. I don't know why they chose that. It's again just creating more confusion, but that's what that pertains to.
Certainly.
Alphabet soup.
Alphabet soup absolutely is absolutely correct. Well, I think what we wanted to do is, I think we were probably going to get into the next several weeks where we really go line by line on the application with you guys. What we really wanted to cover today was the documents that need to be attached to these applications. And the reason why we're sort of covering that first is because as you guys are in your loan periods right now, and you're gathering these applications and keeping track of them, what is it that you need to have in your folder or in your file? So let's talk about payroll for a minute. This is a big list, all referring to payroll documentation. I think what this is trying to do is cover all possible payroll-related records that you may potentially have. And this covers whether you are running your own payroll, you have a third-party payroll provider, or you've got a bookkeeper who's helping you, or you're doing payroll out of Intuit, out of your QuickBooks. So you sort of have a third-party provider, but it's sort of through your own bookkeeping system. So this sort of encompasses all possible payroll records. That doesn't mean that you have to have all of the stuff. But you need to have enough stuff here relating to your particular situation to indicate and satisfy the requirement that shows how much payroll you pay. So for example, actually what I wanted to do is start with B. That talks about the tax forms. Everybody's fairly familiar with those. Those are your quarterly reports, 941. And these are filed on quarterly basis, either by you or by third-party service payroll provider. And those are filed every quarter. So the quarter ends, first quarter ends March 31st. This is going to be due at the end of April. The second quarter ends June 30th. This 941 is due at the end of July. So what the requirement B is saying is asking for is any 941s that would have been filed within your loan period. So you may have a 941 that's filed for the first quarter, or filed for the second quarter, or for the third quarter, depending on where your loan ends up being. This is not to say that the amount on that 941 is going to be your payroll amount, because remember, 941 is a quarterly payroll report that encompasses all payroll for that quarter. Your loan period may start in the middle of quarter one, in the middle of quarter two, and go on. So the 941 amount is not going to be what you use to actually fill out the application to indicate how much payroll you paid. It's going to be your actual payroll records. So, but you anyway have to supply these 941s, okay? So that's what I wanted to definitely bring up. So again, these 941s are not necessarily going to tie to the payroll amounts that are going to be in your loan forgiveness applications, which then gets us into point A, which says bank account statements. Sorry, Jackie. Yep.
I jumped the gun.
She says, I'm done with all this payroll. So in the first bullet point, it talks about the bank statements or third-party payroll service provider reports showing the compensation paid to employees. These are your actual payroll period reports. So if you have a weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly payroll, at the end of every payroll period, you're going to get a report from your payroll provider, your bookkeeper, or you're doing it yourself to show. It's typically broken down by employee, and then you're going to have a total for that payroll period. This is what you are going to be using depending on when your covered or alternative payroll covered period is, to determine how much compensation you actually paid inside the covered period or the alternative payroll covered period. Okay, so that's going to be the key. These are going to be the numbers that are going to feed into the application. Now, what I also wanted to mention here is that those payroll reports have everything. They're going to have the employer portion of payroll tax, employee portion of payroll tax. They're going to have the insurance. They're going to have stuff that comes out of the employee's accounts, the 401k contributions. It's going to have a slew of things. The pieces that you're going to be picking out of here, out of these payroll reports, is going to be the gross salary paid to employees. Okay, so that's the key here. remember that the employer portion of payroll tax is not an eligible expense for this purpose. What you can have, and this is where we get into a B, a second point, is it's the state taxes are okay. Okay, so the state unemployment payments that you make are okay, but the FICA and the Medicare tax, it's not an eligible expense. So when you're looking at these payroll reports for weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, you gotta make sure you're picking up the gross. If you've got a 401k plan and your employees are contributing, the employee's contribution does not impact you as the employer. You're paying them, let's say the employee's salary for that payroll period is $10,000. If they put $2,000 towards 401k, that's none of your concern. You pay them $10,000, what they did with that doesn't matter. So the $10,000 becomes the gross. So you really need to look at those payroll reports and make sure you're picking out the right numbers, which is the gross payroll, okay? Maybe this is a good time to touch a little bit on the covered period versus alternative payroll covered period. For administrative ease, SBA has allowed you, instead of prorating the payroll that you pay from the start of your actual loan period, if it falls right inconveniently in between the payroll period, they allow you to start counting from the beginning of the next full payroll period. So if you got your money on, I think they even had an example here, it was something like April 20th. In your next payroll period begins April 24th. That payroll period you can elect, even though you've got the 4 days, because then you're gonna have a couple of full payroll periods, and it's going to be easier for you to pull those payroll reports for the next, whatever, 2, 3, 4 payroll periods, depending on how often you go, and really easily fill out the application. So even though the last payroll period ends after the loan ends, if you elected that alternative covered period for convenience purposes, that's okay. The key also that SBA is trying to drive home here is that even though that payroll period ends after the loan period, you still need to make sure you actually pay that payroll before the next payroll starts. So you've got to pay the payroll. You can't just say, okay, here's my payroll report, it ends after, and then maybe you ran out of money and now you can afford to pay it. In that case, you cannot use that payroll period for the calculation. So it's got to be the payroll that, even though the payroll period ends after the loan and that's what you're using, you actually have to pay it. Okay, so that's very important. That alternative covered period is only available to those employers that are on weekly or bi-weekly payroll runs, not the monthly ones. Okay, so if you're monthly, then you still have to stick to possibly prorating the payroll, which the key here is if you're in the monthly payroll, likely the payroll is easy enough. Maybe you're a shareholder employee, one, maybe there's 2 or 3 of you. It's going to be easy enough to take the monthly payroll and prorate it for the number of days that fall into your covered period, even though it may not be 100% convenient. Okay. The point number, okay, so C, we've got payment receipt, canceled check, or account statement showing how much you've paid for the employee health insurance and the retirement plan. Typically, you will have a couple of things here that are available. Yes, you will have a bank statement or a copy of the check showing that the money went out. What I would certainly also have here is some sort of statement showing how much your monthly payment for the employee health insurance is. Okay, if you're paying, I think in this case, and Jackie, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're paying, let's say, every 6 months for the health insurance, and you've paid that amount, you can still elect to prorate whatever portion of the health insurance falls into your covered period to be able to do that.
As long as it's paid on time. And yeah. I wanted to just mention something. I don't know if you noticed this, Marina. In the application, and I don't think this was in the application before, they were very clear about the fact that, you know, you're going to get credit for what's either incurred or paid during that covered period or alternative payroll covered period. However, the employee must have actually been employed during that covered period or alternative payroll covered period. So you can't take, say, a new employee that's coming in and they're going to begin after the covered period expires or the alternative period and prepay them. Nor can you take an employee, or if you, let's say you came into this and you had someone who was departing, but their next payroll cycle was falling within the covered period, you're not going to get credit for that person, because even though you've paid it during the covered period, they're not a current employee during that covered period.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I've said covered period like 15 times. So
I know it's and that, Jackie, that is a great point. You cannot prepay. And you cannot prepay, and that's going to be key here, is really maintaining really good documentation here on that. Same thing here in C is relating to the retirement plan as well. I believe there has not been much guidance on that. There was confusion when this came out to say, well, look, I'm making my contributions once a year. If I'm making this contribution once a year and I make it next year, or I make it at the end of the year, can I still use it? And, or if I'm making contribution for last year, this year, because a lot of those matching plans, contributions are actually paid now relating to 2019. So I have not seen any sort of further clarification. I don't know if you guys have, about whether we can just shove all of that payroll or the pension contribution now, or we need to actually take the annual amount and prorate it, or what we have to do with it. Anything? Nothing. Okay.
There's clever practitioners out there that say technically you can do that, but I mean, you can try it, but I wouldn't recommend it.
Yep.
I don't want to be the guinea pig.
Right.
Exactly.
Like I have said from the start, be normal. Like, be as routine in your business operations as you can. That's going to be the key for any of the uncertainty as it goes. If you're doing things the way you've always done them, you're unlikely to have to explain why all of a sudden you shoved everything into one period. So
exactly. And I think for the most part, what we have is a lot of my clients are making these matching contributions now because they're due before the extended filing deadline of the business return. And I think that even if they're making these contributions relating to last year, but they're made this year and they fall into their covered period, I'm telling them, listen, keep track of it. You've got your statement from the pension plan showing how the amount was calculated, how it was paid, what period it's relating to, and let's submit that. And you know, I think that as long as that's done in the normal course of business, a lot of the clients are making those matching contributions on regular basis with every payroll, or maybe monthly. I did advise a couple of you know, self-employed individuals who had a plan, and they had a couple of employees, and there was a retirement plan that normally they wait up to see about the cash flow. And I said, listen, if you have the cash flow, why don't you make a chunk of these contributions inside your covered period? Just again, to have documentation that this pension contribution did relate to 2020, and if I am planning to contribute this much as a match, and I prorated for the loan period, and this is the amount that I paid, you've got a receipt, you've got a documentation from the pension plan that you made that payment, you've got a bank statement. I don't see why that wouldn't be okay to submit with the documentation. But we're going to keep reading. I'm still a little bit gray on that with the pension. So I think the health insurance is a little bit easier because you're having periodic payments on health insurance, even if that periodic payment is quarterly or semi-annually. But the pension, because you've got so much leeway on when that payment goes in, it's still a little bit gray. So we'll just keep telling you guys what we think about that. But in the meantime, please make your normal pension contributions, and please keep track of I would say the statement from the pension plan and the bank statement showing the contribution was made. I think that's it on that page. What I wanted to, the other thing I wanted to mention, well, we're into the non-payroll, so let's go ahead with that, and we'll come back a little bit to the payroll part. The non-payroll, okay. This also gets a little bit extensive. I also want to mention this because, you know, as a tax return preparer, I tell my clients, I don't want to see any of these things for tax return purposes. Please keep track of everything, and as long as it's in your QuickBooks, I'm happy. And this is exactly the opposite of the tax return. With tax return, you don't need to submit any supporting documentation. you have to keep it in case you get audited. In this particular case with this loan forgiveness application, you do need to submit a lot of the documentation. So specifically, for the business mortgage interest payment, they want to see the amortization schedule. A lot of businesses don't even have that. Maybe they got it when they initially got their loan on their building, but it's gone, it's done, it's in their closing package from 10 years ago, and they don't have it. So I am not sure how strict the bank is going to be here if you don't have your amortization schedule, but I think the key is if you've got your loan agreement that shows the interest rate, the duration of the loan, and your monthly payment, you can always put together a quick amortization schedule, and we can help with that as well, because I think that's going to indicate to the bank what exactly of your monthly payment was interest related. Because remember, if you're making those business mortgage payments, it's the interest component only that's an allowed expense here for forgiveness, not your actual principal payments, okay? And Jackie, can we talk a little bit about prepayment or paying back? If you've got a prepayment, I don't believe that's allowed. If you're catching up with some of the old payments, is that okay or not?
I don't think so. I believe that, you know, you're going to get, again, it's similar to the payroll. You're going to get credit for what you either paid or incurred during that covered period. And this is, again, the non-payroll expenses can't be tracked during the alternative period. They have to be tracked during the covered period. So yeah, it's whatever you pay or incur, but not both. And I also wouldn't recommend loading up this period with prepayments, because that's not going to fly.
Yep, absolutely right. Let's touch on the second point, which is the rent or lease. You've got to have your current rent or lease agreement, which is another thing that could be sitting somewhere and you have no idea. So please try. This is a good time now to go back and dig up some of these records. You've got to have your current lease agreement, your rent agreement, and then of course support that you've paid them. So you're going to have copies of the checks that you wrote and having a bank statement showing that the amounts came out. If you're having automated payments, you're not going to have copies of the physical checks, but you're going to have those automated checks from the bank. So even having the bank statement where you may highlight, you know, and you're going to have the vendor that it's going to, which should match to the vendor on your lease statement, should match to the amount that's on your rent statement. Where you, I don't know how crazy you have to get, but a lot of these lease and rent statements are, you know, from years before, and they allow for the increase in lease. So now let's say you're 5 years into your lease, you had increases of 5% every year. Now, of course, what that initial lease payment is on the lease agreement is not what you're paying now. But I think that as long as you supply that agreement, highlight your lease payments you've made through the covered period, matches the vendor, I think you're fine. What I wanted to mention on both these points, the mortgage and also the rent, is if you have refinanced your building or you have renewed or signed into a new lease agreement, again, this is the area where there has not been a lot of guidance. So the rules here are very specific that it's got to be a mortgage entered into prior to February 15th or lease entered into prior to February 15th. Well, what if you refinance your business mortgage after, you know, February, maybe you refinance in March. So is that refinance becomes your new agreement, or do you still, are you only going to be able to deduct the interest payments based on your old mortgage schedule prior to refinance? That's where I think there's a little bit of gray area. I haven't seen much on that. Jackie, what about you?
I haven't, and we have clients who have entered into new leases based upon the natural expiration of a pre-existing lease, and the new lease was entered into after February 15th. And it's not real. I don't think it's very fair. I don't think that this was the intention, but this is an unintended consequence of the very strict drafting surrounding these requirements. So I don't know if at this point we're going to see that soften at all, but unfortunately for a certain number of borrowers, they're just going to be excluded from these expenses being forgiven due to a technicality like that, unfortunately.
And even if you had to move, what if you had to move on March 1st?
Yeah.
So it's not like you chose to, you know, redo a lease agreement. You actually moved. Your lease expired, then you moved into a whole new premise, and your new lease began March 1st.
Exactly.
I don't know how
And
much
that would have all been in motion long before COVID was even a thing. So
Yeah.
Exactly. So maybe the key here will be the documentation that you had actually entered into that agreement before, or at least maybe the agreement wasn't signed until, say, March 1st, but maybe you were already planning on moving and had all the documentation that you were moving and taking possession of that space. I am not sure how much leeway here, but please keep in mind that if you're that time frame is going to be the key. So if you are in those original mortgage payments or lease payments, please pull out those agreements and have them available.
And there are plenty of leases that are entered into on one day, and they might not actually commence, and the doors might not open for another 3 months. So it's really the effective date of that lease that I think will determine that.
Yep, absolutely. The utility payments are a little bit easier. Well, I shouldn't say that because there's gray area in every single line item here. But
I was about to say, like, this is not much better. It's a little bit better.
It's a little bit better because I think you've got more of the ongoing and regular payments here. But again, it's got to be, I guess, a service agreement that you signed up for prior to February 15th. Now, they're not asking for the service agreements on the utility payments. So, which sort of makes sense because I really don't even know if we had a service agreement with the FPL when we moved into our building. I know we're paying them
on my side of the division of labor.
So this is really your utility payments that you pay regularly. So I think here you're going to have your monthly invoices, and you're going to have proof that you actually pay those monthly invoices. That's all that I see being asked here. But the idea here is that, yes, these got to be the agreements that you had entered into prior to February 15th.
And I get about, I don't know, 5 emails a week. Can you talk to us about specifically our realtor friends? Utilities, people get a really broad read on what utilities are. Are they association dues? Are they gas? Are they car lease payments? For the lease that you were talking about in section B, that's contemplating lease of physical business property. But I get that question a lot.
I have a comment on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Jackie. Go ahead.
So when you think about leases, a lease could fall under business rent or lease payments if it is a true business lease. So if you're leasing your car in the name of your S corporation, yes, I think that could technically qualify. If you're leasing it in your individual name, I don't necessarily think that's going to qualify. Also, the with the gas, I feel like that came in. It was a random one-liner and an interim rule that was issued back in April as to independent contractors and Schedule C filers. I don't really think that the true definition contemplates that for most borrowers, and I probably wouldn't go with that because it is tied to a utility based upon an agreement in place before February 15th. So how can that can't naturally extend to your gas? But, of course, people can try. Yeah,
I really think that because these are particularly tied to agreements, when it talks about gas, it really talks about your natural gas or your TCO, not the gas that you go and fill up the car. Because when you go and fill up the car, that's not really it's not pursuant to really any contract or agreement for it. So to continue that train of thought a little bit on the self-employed and our realtor friends, you are using home office, and yes, you're paying rent or you're paying your mortgage interest, and yes, you are deducting the allocated portion of that as a home office expense on your tax return. That is not an allowed expense for the PPP loan forgiveness. So you will still get the benefit of it by having it as a tax deduction, by allocating home office expense. And remember, the utilities for the home office expense, so your mortgage interest, your utilities are all going to be prorated as a home office and allowed to be deducted in certain situations. I'm not saying everybody can do that anyway, but for those that are taking home office expense, this is okay. This is not okay for the allowed expense under PPP loan forgiveness rules. So this goes to our realtor friends that are working at home. Anybody else really who's, you know, working at home and living out of the car, really, you don't really have a business utility. You've got your phone, you know, you may have your cell phone in a business name. That's not going to be a huge expense for this purpose anyway. You're talking about 8 or 24 weeks expense of that. But the key here, people were trying to allocate their home mortgage that they're, you know, using as a home office, but that is not allowed here. It's got to be particularly business space that you're using. Okay.
Marina, if we're talking about mortgage interest only, and I think the portion of the home that you can even allocate to your business cuts that down even more, we're really talking about a pretty small amount of money there.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. Yeah, very, very small amount. Absolutely right. Now we get into the documentation which you do not need to submit. So everything that we've covered now, please have ready, and there's going to be an opportunity for you to make copies or scan it and submit it to the bank.
When you get near your pile, let me know.
Absolutely. And it's going to be a big pile. And, you know, this is when people were applying for the PPP loans and all they had to provide was payroll documentation to calculate the 2.5 months of 12 months payroll. People had hard enough time as it is. Where's my 941? What's a 940? Is it the W-3? What is a 944? Does that even apply to me? There's a lot of documentation here that you have to submit. So I would say start gathering that process, and please re-listen to this again if you missed it. But we'll keep, as we hear more, or if the rules ease up a little bit as we get into it, definitely we'll bring that to you. And the other thing I want to mention, guys, is these are the SBA rules. When the banks start collecting these applications, they may have some additional things they want you to submit. For example, during the loan application process, a lot of banks were asking businesses for, you know, articles of organization and, you know, a lot of these things that SBA didn't really ask for. SBA just wanted, you know, the payroll report basis to calculate the loan, but the banks had their particular requirements. So I wonder if there may be some additional things the banks will require you to submit as well. But if you've got these pieces ready, I think you're in good shape. So moving on to, these are the documents that we touched on a little bit. This has to do with the whole employee count and what happened to these employees. So if you put an offer and you know the employees refuse the offer, or you try to rehire to replace them, or they quit, or you fired them for cause, that sort of documentation does not need to be submitted with the application, but you definitely need to have it and retain it, and you have to retain it for 6 years. Now, anytime I tell my clients you don't have to submit something, immediately they hear it as, I don't need it.
I don't even need to know where it is.
I don't even need to know how to spell it. Well, this is not the case here. You've got 6 years. 6 years, guys, that SBA can come back and say, show me that you had made an offer to bring this person back and the person refused. This is not something that you can recreate, like people say, you know, if I need to recreate my mileage log, if I get audited, I will. This is not it. You're not going to know 3 years from now, and particularly 6 years from now, why you wanted this employee to come back to begin with. You're not even going to remember that this is for you.
Who is Susan Smith? I don't remember her.
Exactly. So you have no idea if anybody is ever going to come and ask you for this. But the key is to have it documented now. Now, when you know what's happening, if you put job ads to replace some of these people, you need to have copies of those. You need to probably have the printout and when the job ad was posted and when you took it down. This is not something that you're going to be able to go back and recreate years later. So please, I encourage you, the same thing when it comes to economic uncertainty. I encourage all my clients that if you're ever challenged that you did have economic uncertainty and that was the reason for loan application, please have that documented, whether it's the minutes, whether you're meeting with your business partners, or whether it's you sitting down and writing a memo to your own file to say, this is what's happening at this time, kind of like a moment in time, and this is what was happening in my business, and that's why I applied for the loan. These are the types of things I want you to put together now, so that you never have a question as to what was going on. Also, I think the reduction in salaries, it's the same idea. So here it's going to be, I think, a little bit easier, because you will have the payroll reports that will show, you know, employee by employee how the salary was reduced. And the key here is that if you did restore the salaries, that you will have the payroll reports for later payroll periods to show that that salary was restored. But definitely, I would say for the whole 2020, make sure you know exactly where all your payroll records are, all of the payroll forms, and all of the payroll statements are for the full entire year, just to be safe. So I think that would probably be a good rule of thumb to have. If we move on, Jackie, I wanted to mention, yeah, we covered this, I think, a little bit. So essentially, if you know, you did have the need to close, and you had the orders, the governmental orders that you needed to close and be closed, definitely you need to have copies of those.
And if you're also trying to rehire or replace employees,
yes,
they go into that a little bit too, and you definitely want to keep those applications that you received in the resumes.
Most definitely. Keep in mind, and this is, I think, what I wanted to really touch on here before we wrap up this morning, is that as we get into walking you guys through a little bit on the short, the easy form versus the long form, the long form is really where you're gonna go through restoration safe harbor if you fall into that. So the records that you need to keep for the long form, if you did have to let somebody go and then you restored them, as we discussed earlier, those are the records that you're going to need to keep and have ready to submit with the application if you're submitting the long form. So that's where the difference is going to be between the documents required for the easy application and the long form application. It's going to be the restoration, really. I think that's the big difference in the record keeping. Also, I wanted to say, generally speaking, just because you're filling out the easy form doesn't mean that it's easy. So it just, there's less pages and it's certainly a lot more simple, but the key, guys, is that the documentation we just walked you through, that applies to the easy form. So the long form has that, plus the restoration documentation if you had to restore your headcount and salaries. But all of those things that we had mentioned on the payroll, the rent, the lease agreement, the utility agreement, the receipts and the canceled checks, all of that applies first to the easy form. So, I think it's going to make a little bit more sense as we start going line by line with some of these items. But now I felt that was critical to start early, because now is the time for you guys to start digging up and getting the files ready. I think that was it. Anything else, Jackie, that you wanted to touch on that I may not have mentioned on the documentation piece?
I guess that with respect to the easy form, the documents that you have to maintain also need to include the substantiation of the fact that you didn't have any reduction in your employees from January 1st through the end of your covered period. So it's going to require a little more documentation to be retained on that end if you're going to be utilizing this form, because that's one of the bases for being able to use this form. So,
yeah.
And also, you'll see that I underlined and bolded certain portions of this that talks to the fact that they want you, and this is in both applications, they want you to retain documentation supporting the certification as to the necessity of the loan request. That's what Marina was touching on earlier. So that's really important. And also, we're kind of just highlighting here the 6-year period after the date that the loan is forgiven, not the date when you submit the loan forgiveness application. It's after the date the loan is forgiven. That's when the 6-year period starts to toll, and you want to make sure that you keep all those in a neat, orderly manner, because if SBA comes knocking on your door 4 years later, it'll be a lot easier to answer those questions.
It's so easy. She's underlined and bolded damn near the entire paragraph. What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah.
seriously. Oh.
Wow. I think that's a lot for today.
If you guys feel confused, please don't be shocked, because you have no idea how many hours the three of us are putting in to discussions with each other, to reading the actual statutes, to listening to other technical webinars and practice information from other authoritative sources. And this is what we do every day, and we are sometimes scratching our heads. I had somebody email me yesterday and say, I don't know how you even, how do you even have the will to keep reading? You know, and it's something that we feel strongly about, is our obligation to the business community. Those are our clients and our friends, and we have a duty to do our part that we can to contribute back. So it's not always fun, it's not always pretty. We may change our tune as the rules change, but if you're frustrated, so are we. And don't give up, because this is we're headed into the finish line, and at some point these rules will start to formalize and change less. So I won't say stop changing, because I won't lie to you. I don't think they'll ever stop changing. Even after you get forgiveness, there will probably be a post-forgiveness application to file, and Jackie will be all over that as well.
It would be nice if I could go 2 days without going to the SBA page and seeing new interim rules posted.
At this point, we open a page like,
yeah,
you're afraid to look. Like. I've never been so afraid to go to a government website.
Oh my gosh.
Oh boy. All righty. We have a bunch of thank yous. As always, we appreciate that. It does, when those fill our inbox and our physical mailboxes, it really has made our day. So thank you so much, everybody. Stay tuned, have a safe weekend, and we will see you next Tuesday.